What's going on, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages? Joker back again, once again. So, I've seen a lot of videos reviewing Malfeasance, most of which basically state that the gun looks cool, but the damage it does is kind of insignificant, and the exotic perk and the exotic trait never really come into play. And I was actually on board with this line of reasoning as well. I'd written an entire script about this, I did a bunch of testing, and on paper, it looked really bad. Then when I was recording my script, I stated that the percentage of damage that Explosive Shadow does was roughly 35%. I say roughly because what's presented in game and what the actual numbers on the back end are tend to be slightly different. All damage is rounded, so for example, a weapon could do 639 damage, but its actual damage is 639.5479623518675 So when you start looking at individual damage ticks, trying to guess percentages will always be somewhat slightly off. 35% of 639 would be 223.64, but the game displays it as 225. So this is undoubtedly a combination of the damage tick's hidden values, which leaves the 225 a damage tick, with most definitely some hidden values as well. This is important, because when I was doing the math later on in the video, I for some reason thought the damage percent was 20, not 35. So, it of course, fucked my numbers. Why am I telling you this? Well, when I went back and readjusted my numbers and fixed my mistake, I found that Malfeasance is actually kind of a powerhouse, at least for a primary weapon. And yet, somehow, it's still pretty terrible. Let me explain. For most of my testing, I took Malfeasance and compared it to Ace of Spades. While not in the same rate of fire category or damage tier, the idea was less about showing off which one did more damage, and just comparing that Malfeasance, for the work required to get it, isn't as good as Ace of Spades, which is a vastly easier quest. And that's still actually quite true, but for different reasons than I originally started with. For testing, I went to IO and started shooting this Lost Sector boss. Malfeasance gains a 13 to 15% buff when damaging taken. The breakdown currently looks something like this. And then I was talking to streamer and Planet Destiny contributor Nemplays, link for his stuff will be in the description below, and he sent me footage where the breakdown looks like this, which showed a 15% increase. So for the sake of argument, we'll go with a 15% buff. I just wanted to note that if you did the math on my numbers and you only got a 13% buff, I don't know why. Sometimes it's 13, sometimes it's 15. If I had to make a guess, it's probably something to do with light level, though I'm significantly over the level of where I'm at, so I don't know, I can't tell you. Anyways, like I said, for the sake of argument, we'll go with a 15% buff when we do all of our math, but against the Lost Sector boss, the DPS for our two weapons looks something like this. I'm not entirely sure if the Malfeasance exotic perk, Explosive Shadow, gains a 15% buff or not, but again, for the sake of argument, we'll say that it does. In terms of pure damage numbers against Taken, Malfeasance significantly outdamages Ace of Spades. But what about against normal enemies? Anything that's not Taken? Well, 15% of 12,960 is 1,944, so we'll simply subtract that, which brings us to 11,016. And that makes sense. Malfeasance has Explosive Shadow, and 2 more rounds in the magazine. So it would technically do more damage over time than Ace of Spades. And yet, although that damage might be better in a vacuum, Malfeasance is nowhere near close to being as good or better than Ace of Spades. Simply one look at the retinue of perks Ace of Spades offers will show that. Third Eye, Firefly, Outlaw, Memento Mori, which increases the damage of 6 bullets in the gun. An amazing range stat, a not too shabby handling or stability stat, a slowish reload speed, but that's circumvented by Outlaw and hand cannon reload gloves. Malfeasance, by comparison, can put out some nasty damage, particularly against Taken. But it can only do that against something that can take that kind of damage. So now we run into an issue of the practical versus the theoretical. I'll get into the details of it in a moment, but the TLDR version is Ace of Spades will always do this. Or it'll do this. And Malfeasance, when it's not doing this, is just a normal 180 hand cannon that does slightly more damage to Taken than 180 hand cannons should do, but not as much damage to enemies just in general as a 140 does. Note, I mean bullet for bullet, not damage over time. The long version goes something like this. Once we start fighting enemies that can take almost 13k worth of damage, Malfeasance naturally loses against weapons that are meant to fight bosses that can take 13k worth of damage. Your DPS kings like your Escalation Protocol shotgun or the Whisper of the Worm. In fact, realistically, any special or heavy weapon is going to be more effective against enemies that can take 13k worth of damage than Malfeasance. Malfeasance exists in an odd space where, theoretically, it's probably one of the most damaging primaries in the game. Theoretically. Except, it only works against bosses, which it doesn't do enough damage against quickly enough to justify using it over the Escalation Protocol shotgun, or Whisper of the Worm, or any special or heavy. And, as a primary that you're using to clear ads, you're not going to be able to take advantage of its exotic perk, and you'll only get use of its trait when fighting Taken. But even then, you're only going to potentially kill something with one less shot than it would take normally. So, basically, when you're not fighting a boss, Malfeasance is just a really, really nice looking 180 hand cannon that takes up your exotic slot and isn't as good as Ace of Spades, which is obtained from a vastly, significantly easier questline. On the PvP side, again, Malfeasance is just somewhat a competent 180 hand cannon. 4 shots to the head, 5 to the body, and a 5-shot kill regardless of how much damage drop-off Malfeasance experiences, as the super combined Needler effect is always a guaranteed 100 damage unless the person is in super, which sounds great on paper, but isn't really practical. Why wouldn't I just use Ace of Spades or Luna's Howl or Pulse Rifle to get a near guaranteed 3-shot kill? And when it comes to Gambit, really? You're not using Sleeper? You're not using something way better for clearing ads? You get what I'm saying? It's just not that good. Sure, in that one instance where you have an invader, and I don't know, you just didn't have heavy ammo, but you for some reason had Malfeasance equipped, you're gonna 3-tap him, but why aren't you using Sleeper? Why aren't you using Play of the Game? Why aren't you using a rocket launcher? Why aren't you using a sniper? Why aren't you using basically anything else in the game? Because if you are using Malfeasance, as opposed to anything else, you're actively being a detriment to your team. And mind you, I'm talking about using this against an invader as opposed to something else. Like, why would you take Malfeasance out to use it against an invader when you could use a heavy? And cut short that invader's invasion and giving them less time to kill you or your teammates. What I'm saying is it's just not practical when you compare it to anything else you can use against an invader, or in any other instance for that matter. And there doesn't seem to be a way to really adequately address this. At 5 shots, Explosive Shadow is worthless against anything that's not a boss, or a player outside optimal range. Its trait only works against the Taken. Sure, they could buff the trait so that it does extra damage against all minions of the darkness, but at that point, it's still just a very competent 180 hand cannon that does slightly less damage than a 140. And this does nothing to address the exotic perk, the perk the weapon was built around. They could give it the Polaris Lance treatment, where it refunds ammo for each crit, and after 5 crit shots an explosive round is fired, that detonates and does DOT damage to enemies in the radius of the explosion, but now we've just made Malfeasance Polaris Lance. I've also seen it suggested that they move the slug count from 5 to 3. However, this would make Malfeasance a guaranteed 3-shot kill. In fact, it would be a better PvP weapon than Luna's Howl and Not Forgotten, as any target would take an automatic 60 damage no matter what, just as long as they were shot 3 times. The numbers would look something like this. On body shots, it would be 39 damage each, plus the perk, which means 170 damage, which I think is the only combination which won't kill. 1 crit and 2 body shots, you get 195 damage, which will kill, I believe, 0 to 1 armor builds. 2 crits and a body shot, and you get 213 damage, which I believe will kill anything not in a super. And then 3 crits, you get 231 damage, which again will kill anything not in a super. It actually wouldn't surprise me to find out that Malfeasance started out as a 3-shot kill and was nerfed during development because of its potency. So, like I've illustrated, in its current iteration, Malfeasance doesn't really work. It's an exotic weapon whose direct competition isn't actually something like Ace of Spades. It's Whisper of the Worm and the EP shotgun. It's a weapon with absurd damage capabilities, theoretically, especially for a primary hand cannon, but against targets you have no good reason to use a primary hand cannon against. And yet, Malfeasance, on a functional level, as is, will and can never be buffed to a point where it breaks out of this competition with weapons that far outclass it. You could rework the Taken Predator perk to encompass all enemies of the darkness, but then you just have a hand cannon that, shot for shot, bullet for bullet, not damage over time, but sheer one-shot, kill this ad, kill that ad, move on, will be less effective than something like Ace of Spades or Midnight Coup. You could increase the percentage of damage that Explosive Shadow does, but unless it's something ludicrous like 100% buff with a huge blast radius, and in that theoretically, on paper, can put out a lot of damage, but it's still trying to compete with the EP shotgun and Whisper of the Worm, because the only time you can get that damage is against bosses, which you're going to use the EP shotgun or Whisper of the Worm or any special or any heavy against, likely before you use an exotic hand cannon that theoretically can do a lot of damage. And the second you take this weapon from 5 slugs to explode to 3, you've just categorically made it the best weapon in PvP. I don't think you fix Malfeasance in its current iteration, not without a rework or not without breaking the Crucible. Without doing either of those, Malfeasance will have the same issues after being buffed that it has now. One of the things that Bungie could do with Malfeasance, and this goes back to the reworking of the weapon, is they could give it the Ace of Spades treatment, where it's just super user-friendly, and has a retinue of perks that makes it really useful in a lot of situations. Since Malfeasance is technically Thorn, but with Taken instead of Hive used in its construction, they could bring back some of the features that made Thorn an overall user-friendly weapon. In Destiny 1, when you tagged somebody with a Thorn round, they would start bleeding out and you could see damage ticks so you knew where they were going. We actually currently have similar perks in the game that put a red X over an opponent that marked them once they've been shot. So take that, add high caliber rounds, significantly increase the range stat, and all of this kind of plays up the utility of the weapon being a guaranteed 5-shot kill in PvP. Take this on top of doing some of the other suggested things, like making Taken Predator a perk that is universal for all minions of the darkness, and you have a weapon that starts to eke itself out as being super viable. The addition of high caliber rounds is probably the most important part of this buff, as, think about it. 1, just look at what you're shooting at people. You're shooting these big fucking glass needles at somebody, or energy needles at somebody, and they're impacting and they're staying there. That's going to make people flinch. So, 1, just looking at it, that makes sense. 2nd, you're firing these explosive slugs into the face of a Hive Knight or a Fallen Captain. The ability to stagger that enemy would be super beneficial. Or even look at it in the case of Primevals. The ability to fire slugs and do damage that staggers a Primeval could justify this weapon's use in Gambit over something like Sleeper, or snipers, or linear fusion rifles like the Queensbreaker's Bow, or tracking rocket launchers like Twin-Tailed Fox, or basically anything else you can think of. In PvP, with the ability to see your opponents behind walls with a tracking perk, with high caliber rounds, with more range, you've created a weapon that's not the best in the game, and it's not just arbitrarily better than Luna's Howl or Not Forgotten because you can just 3-tap somebody without much care for where you're actually hitting them, but what you have done is you've created a very competent weapon that synergizes with itself. The whole idea of the weapon is to land 5 shots and make something explode. Speaking of making things explode, they should make the explosion better, because it still does activate upon the death of the target, so you could get an AoE effect going on. This idea kind of makes it to where getting those 5 shots is the function of the gun, and the explosion is the reward of doing so. And because the explosion is the reward, it should do a little more than just explode. I mean, how many guns in the game do we have that if you shoot something, it explodes? Keeping in line with where Malfeasance came from, you could add a DOT effect to that explosion, much like Polaris Lance's DOT effect. And I've never seen anybody complain about Polaris Lance's DOT effect, likely because that DOT effect isn't what kills you. What is the 5 shots that hit you before the DOT effect activated. But it's still a potent and interesting effect. Even if the explosive radius of this isn't like huge damage everywhere, like every other explosive perk in the game is, what you get is this kind of DOT perk that starts infecting things around the center mass of the explosion, which would be great in what? Gambit. My hypothetical wet dream of an explosive shadow perk would look something like this. Fires an explosive round that marks, staggers, and burrows into a target. Once 5 have been stacked, they detonate, dealing 35% of the individual round's damage to the target and the surrounding area. Things affected by this are poisoned and bleed out for a short time. The trait taken Predator would become Predator of the Darkness, and it would do 15% more damage to all minions of the Darkness. And also the range bar would be significantly increased. Now, some of you might be thinking that all of this in one go, in one buff, might be a little too much. I could see that. The last thing we want is another case of Graviton Lance, where something was mediocre or just kind of okay, and it was buffed into godhood in one update. What they could do is take some of this and add it now, and also add an exotic catalyst where the other side of this buff is added to the weapon, but you have to get the catalyst. I think that's a great idea, but of course I do. It's my idea. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and like always, stay frosty.